Breaking overnight, the Justice Department says it wants to make public 5 days of grand jury testimony against Jeffrey Epstein and his associate, Ghislaine Maxwell. This after two of the victims of Epstein voiced deep concern over the Trump administration's request to unseal that testimony. Joining us now, former federal prosecutor Alyse Adamson. Alyse, thanks so much for being here with us. Start first with this. How likely is the judge to do what the DOJ is asking? And in the grand scheme of things, how rare is it for a judge to do what the DOJ is asking?
Yes, Jessica, it's hard to predict just for the very reason that this request is very rare. This is an unusual, and I may even say extraordinary request to unseal these grand jury transcripts. And the reason I say this is because this is still an active case. We should not forget that Maxwell still has an active appeal, which she's now bringing all the way up to the Supreme Court to have her conviction reversed. So that means ultimately her case could even go back to trial. Judges would be hesitant under those circumstances to release grand jury transcripts. I mean, look, as it is, there are limited circumstances in which grand jury transcripts are unsealed. In extraordinary circumstances, judges are inclined to deny the request for the prejudice to the defendant, the prejudice to the victims in this case, just the prejudice to the integrity of the court proceedings if they are still active. So while it is hard to predict, ultimately the judge may decide to release redacted smaller excerpts of this grand jury transcripts. It's also very possible he'll flat out deny the request, given all of the reasons that I just articulated.
And as they're evaluating this, we have already gotten some statements from some of the victims asking the judge to take special care in making sure their identities remain sealed, talking about how they feel like they are political pawns in all of this. How might those statements factor into the judge's decision here?
Look, Jessica, it's interesting because while the victims, and I think it's also significant that we heard from the victims, because for a case that is about victims, we have kind of lost their narrative in this entire Epstein file, really debacle for the Trump administration. And it's to their point that this has been politicized. It's become transparency rather than a case about victims. But the victims are not opposing the release of the transcripts. To the contrary, they're actually, one was calling for the release and full transparency in an effort to make this story come to an end. This has been in the news cycle for weeks. And so you can understand how victims in this case can feel re-victimized by this continuing conversation. So what the victims were saying in the letter to the judge wasn't, don't release the transcripts. It was, please let our lawyer comb through these transcripts and make sure that they remove any potentially identifying information so they can remain anonymous. So I think a judge is going to balance those concerns. And again, because they are not opposing it like Maxwell did, I think the judge is going to take that into account when rendering a decision.